He sold his first major screenplay for $1. He had no film degree. He had been fired from his first directing job after a handful of days on set. He was 28 years old, sick with fever in a cheap hotel room in Rome, eating food he had taken from other guests' abandoned room service trays in the corridor outside his door, with no money and no ticket home. In the grip of that fever, the idea came to him. A chrome skeleton emerging from fire, dragging itself forward on its arms. He sketched it on hotel stationery in the dark and flew home to build an entire career around it. At 71 years old, James Francis Cameron has directed 3 of the 4 highest-grossing films in the history of cinema, made the first solo dive to the deepest known point of the ocean, and spent more than 4 decades proving that the distance between what currently exists and what he can imagine is not a reason to stop, it is simply the next problem to solve. Before any of that, there was a boy in a small Canadian town who wanted to understand how everything worked, and a mother who taught him that the answer to that question was also the beginning of art. If this story holds something you recognize, stay with it. James Francis Cameron was born on August 16, 1954, in Kapuskasing, Ontario, a small resource town in the boreal forest of northern Ontario, remote enough that the nearest major city required the kind of drive that shapes a child's understanding of distance and scale. The family later moved to Chippewa, a small community in the Niagara region, where Cameron spent his formative years. Chippewa sits within the orbit of Niagara Falls, close enough to feel the presence of extraordinary natural power just beyond the edge of the ordinary. The mist was part of the landscape. The falls were simply there, enormous and indifferent, doing what they had always done. His father, Philip Cameron, was an electrical engineer, a man who understood systems, who knew how things connected and why, who brought a precision and a logical intelligence to the household that shaped how his oldest child thought about every problem he would ever face. His mother, Shirley Cameron, was an artist and a nurse, a woman who saw beauty in things, who encouraged her son to paint, who arranged an exhibition of his early work at a local gallery, who taught him that observation and feeling were not separate from each other, but were the same thing expressed 2 different ways. Those 2 inheritances, the engineer and the artist, would never leave him. Everything Cameron has built as a filmmaker is the product of both of them simultaneously, operating at the same time, in the same frame. He was 15 years old when he saw Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. By his own account, the film stopped him cold. The visual effects, the ambition, the way Kubrick had made the human imagination visible on a screen. Cameron has said that from that moment, he could not stop thinking about how films were made. A child who had already been building functional catapults with his playmates, who had organized elaborate adventuring expeditions in the landscape around Niagara, now had a much larger construction project in his mind. He did not yet have the tools. He spent the next decade acquiring them. When the Cameron family moved to Brea, California in 1971, James was 17 years old. He enrolled at Fullerton Community College, studied physics, switched to English, and then left without completing his degree. The decision was not directionless. He had already understood something. The knowledge he needed to make films was not inside a classroom. It was inside the equipment, inside the process. He drove a truck for years to support himself, studying every piece of film technology he could locate, reading the books, learning the craft of visual effects the way a person learns a language by refusing to be in any other room. In 1978, Cameron raised money from a group of dentists in the Fullerton area and made a 12-minute science fiction short called Xenogenesis. To understand how to operate the camera, he and his collaborators dismantled it and spent the first half of the shoot putting it back together. The short was not polished. It was not meant to be. It was a proof of concept, evidence to himself that the tools could be commanded, that what lived in his mind could be brought to physical existence if he was willing to do whatever the work required. He was 23 years old and already living by that principle without compromise. Xenogenesis brought him to the attention of Roger Corman's New World Pictures, the legendary low-budget production company that served for a whole generation of filmmakers as a school that gave no degrees. Cameron started as a model maker. Corman elevated him quickly because his business depended on recognizing what people could do. By the time New World made Battle Beyond the Stars in 1980, Cameron was the special effects supervisor, building miniature spacecraft out of necessity and invention. He also did effects work on John Carpenter's Escape from New York in 1981. He was learning at a rate that no formal training could have matched, because he was learning in environments with no safety net. You got it right or the film did not work. The first directorial job was Piranha 2, The Spawning in 1982. It was not what it appeared to be. The Italian producer, Ovidio Assonidis, hired Cameron and then systematically stripped him of every meaningful authority, gave him a crew that did not speak English, prevented him from watching his own footage, and fired him after a few days on set. Cameron traveled to Rome for post-production, hoping to see the film and possibly salvage something from the experience. He spent his entire advance on the plane ticket. He had no money for food. He survived on leftovers taken from hotel trays in the corridor outside his door. He became sick with fever, running a temperature in a cheap Roman hotel, broke and exhausted and humiliated, with no way home. And in that particular extremity, lying in the dark, he had a nightmare, a metallic torso, chrome, emerging from an explosion, dragging itself across the floor with knives where hands should be. He woke and sketched it on hotel stationery. In a 2010 interview on 60 Minutes, Cameron said, "I was sick with a high fever and had a dream of this chrome metallic death figure coming out of a fire, a skeletal robot, if you will. I woke up with that image in mind, did some drawings, and then just structured a story around that. When he returned to California, he wrote The Terminator. He sold the complete script to producer Gail Ann Hurd for $1, on the condition that he would direct it. He had nothing to lose. He had already lost everything available to him in Rome. The Terminator opened in October 1984. Made on a budget of $6.5 million, it grossed $78 million worldwide. It made Arnold Schwarzenegger, known primarily as a bodybuilder turned novelty actor, into one of the most bankable action stars in the world. It established Cameron, without any qualification, as a filmmaker of exceptional technical command and instinctive storytelling force. The world it built, the red-eyed machine, the future war, the logic of fate and resistance, was rendered with a coherence and a dread that came from the same mind that had studied physics and built catapults in the Niagara Mist. It did not feel like a low-budget debut. It felt like a statement of what was coming. What Terminator introduced was a quality that would define everything Cameron built afterward. He described it himself with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. I like difficult. I'm attracted by difficult. Difficult is a fucking magnet for me. I go straight to difficult. That is not a pose. It is a description of a working method. The most gifted filmmakers, Cameron argued, will not attempt the most difficult things. That leaves the most difficult things available to the person willing to do them. And the most difficult things, done fully, produce results that no one else can produce, because no one else was willing to try. Aliens came in 1986, a sequel to Ridley Scott's original, made for $18 million. It grossed more than $180 million worldwide and earned 7 Oscar nominations. Sigourney Weaver received a Best Actress nomination for a role in an action film, an almost unprecedented recognition. Cameron had made something the industry was compelled to take seriously. And then came The Abyss in 1989, and the fullest test yet of how far that principle of difficulty would take him. He shot approximately 40% of the film underwater, inside an abandoned nuclear power plant in Gaffney, South Carolina, in tanks holding millions of gallons of water. The cast and crew trained as divers and spent 10 to 12 hours a day submerged. The conditions were punishing past the point most productions would have stopped. Those who endured it eventually called the film not The Abyss, but The Abuse. Actress Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio walked off the set one afternoon and refused to return until the following day. Ed Harris reportedly wept alone in his car during the shoot, not for the camera, simply because the experience had reached that level. Cameron himself nearly drowned. Filming 30 feet underwater, weighted down with 40 pounds of gear to hold himself stable against the bottom of the tank, his air supply ran out. The safety regulator shoved into his mouth by a diver had a rip through the diaphragm. No air. He reached the surface, barely, through a sequence of narrow escapes, arriving at exactly the right moment. He later said, "I don't ever want to go through this again." He went through versions of it on every film he made after that. The Abyss won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. More significantly, it was the first film in history to use photorealistic computer-generated imagery for a moving character. The water creature that probes the underwater station with the face of one of the crew. Cameron was already building the technology the next film would require, because the next film would always require something that did not yet exist. Alongside the films ran the marriages, and what they reveal about the cost of a life built entirely around total commitment to work. Cameron married 5 times. Sharon Williams, a waitress, in 1978, divorced 1984. Gail Ann Hurd, the producer to whom he had sold the Terminator script for $1, in 1985, divorced 1989. Kathryn Bigelow, a filmmaker of genuine ambition, in 1989, divorced 1991. Linda Hamilton, the actress who played Sarah Connor, whom he put through months of extraordinary physical preparation for Terminator 2, had a daughter with him, Josephine Archer, born in 1993. They married in 1997 and divorced in 1999. Hamilton received approximately $50 million in the settlement. She said of the relationship years later, "Everywhere he's convex, I'm concave." Cameron reflected on this pattern with the specificity he brings to everything. "I was actively married, cohabitating for 1 year, 4 times. So I wasn't very good at it. It's a learned art." Each of those marriages ended not because the commitments were shallow, but because a man who runs toward the most difficult thing in the room, always, will eventually exhaust the space that other things require. The films were total. They consumed what they consumed. What remained went home. The irony built into those years is one of the more remarkable facts in the history of American cinema. Kathryn Bigelow, his third wife, married 2 years, divorced in 1991, went on to make The Hurt Locker. In 2010, at the 82nd Academy Awards, she became the first woman in the history of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to win the Oscar for Best Director. She won it against James Cameron, who was nominated that same year for Avatar. His ex-wife made history by defeating him on the largest stage the film industry has. Before the ceremony, Cameron had said publicly, "I've extolled her virtues to the world and supported her as a filmmaker. I'd be tremendously proud if she won." When she won, he applauded. There is no script for that particular evening. Titanic was the film that tested the outer limits of what the industry believed was survivable, and then exceeded them in every direction simultaneously. Cameron announced in 1995 that he would make Titanic rather than Terminator 3. Shooting began in 1996 in Rosarito, Mexico, with a budget that started at $110 million and climbed past $200 million. Cameron had a full-scale partial replica of the ship constructed, with a 17-million-gallon water tank built to hold it. He made 11 dives to the actual Titanic wreck, 2.5 miles underwater in the North Atlantic, because the ship had to be accurate. It had gone down in 1912. He descended to it in 1995 and 1996, because the thing had to be right. In his work, the thing always had to be right. The industry mocked the production openly. The schedule slipped repeatedly. The budget was the largest in Hollywood history. Films had ended careers for less. Cameron later said, "It was pretty intense the whole time. We basically thought we were doomed." During the Halifax shoot of the film's framing sequences, someone spiked the craft service's clam chowder with PCP. Dozens of crew members were hospitalized. Cameron, visibly affected, eyes blood red, found Bill Paxton afterward, both of them holding whatever they had to hold, while the rest of the crew was still in various states of collapse and confusion. The film had not yet been cut. The crisis was not over. Titanic opened on December 19, 1997. It grossed more than $2 billion in its total release. It received 14 Academy Award nominations, tying the all-time record. It won 11, also a record at the time, later tied. Cameron won Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Film Editing. At the podium, he raised his Oscar above his head and shouted the line from the film, "I'm king of the world." The moment entered Oscar history as a cautionary example of how not to accept an award. It was also entirely in character. A man who had spent 2 years being told his ship was going to sink stood at the podium of the Academy Awards and announced that it had not. But Titanic would not be his largest film. That had been conceived in 1994, written as an 80-page treatment for a science fiction film set on a moon called Pandora, populated by a humanoid species called the Na'vi, whose culture and ecosystem were being destroyed by human resource extraction. He had the story. He did not yet have the technology to make it real, so he waited 15 years. And while he waited, he helped build the technology that would be required. Avatar began production in 2006. The finished film required new performance capture systems capable of recording actors' faces and bodies simultaneously in motion, software that could render photorealistic alien landscapes and creatures, a Na'vi language built from scratch by linguist Paul Frommer, and over 900 people working on digital effects alone. The budget was $237 million, though some estimates placed the true cost higher. Cameron told his studio that if it did not work, there was no recovery. Avatar opened in December 2009. It became the first film in history to earn $2 billion at the global box office. Then $2.5 billion. It held the record as the highest-grossing film ever made for 12 years. 9 Academy Award nominations. 3 wins. It changed how the film industry understood three-dimensional cinema and performance capture technology. When Avatar: The Way of Water was released in December 2022, 13 years later, it grossed $2.3 billion and became the third highest-grossing film ever made, behind the original Avatar and Titanic. Before its release, Cameron had told GQ that the sequel was the worst business case in movie history, that it would need to rank among the 4 highest-grossing films ever just to break even. It succeeded. He had placed a bet of $300 to $400 million on his own ability, and he was right. Between those two films, in March 2012, James Cameron climbed inside a submersible he had spent 7 years helping to engineer. A 24-foot-tall vehicle he described as a vertical torpedo, painted lime green so it could be found in the dark, and descended alone into the Pacific Ocean southwest of Guam. He was going to the Challenger Deep, the deepest known point on Earth. The descent took 2 hours and 36 minutes. At 35,756 feet, 6.7 miles beneath the ocean surface, the deep-sea Challenger settled on the seafloor. Cameron was the third human being ever to reach this point, following Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, who had gone together in 1960. He was the first person to make the descent alone. He spent approximately 3 hours on the bottom, collecting samples and documenting what he found in a place no human being had ever scientifically explored in a manned vehicle. He described the bottom as more alien to humans than the moon, as utterly barren and still, a landscape of fine sediment built up over millions of years. He texted his support team at the surface, "All systems okay." He surfaced after a faster-than-expected ascent. He called the expedition the culmination of a lifelong dream. The ocean had fascinated him since childhood, since an exhibit on submarines he visited at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, since the falls near Chippewa, since the first time he understood that what lay beneath the water was a world entirely separate from the one above it, governed by different physics, accessible only through technology and will. Both things are true about him simultaneously and always have been. The filmmaker and the explorer are not two different people performing two different roles. They are the same compulsion expressed in two different directions. The same refusal to accept that the world as currently configured marks the outer limit of what can be seen or made or understood. He married Susie Amos on June 4, 2000. She had appeared in Titanic, playing Rose's granddaughter in the contemporary scenes framing the story. They have 3 children together: Claire, born 2001, James Quinn, born 2003, Elizabeth Rose, born 2006. Cameron also has a daughter, Josephine, from his relationship with Linda Hamilton. The family settled in New Zealand on 2,500 acres near Lake Punui in the Wairarapa Valley, purchased in 2012, a working farm being transitioned toward regenerative and plant-based agriculture. Susie co-founded Muse School in California in 2006, the first school in the country to serve a fully plant-based cafeteria. Cameron co-founded Plant Power Task Force in 2014 and has used his public platform to advocate for the connection between food systems and climate change. In the summer of 2025, he became a New Zealand citizen. He lives on that farm above the ocean, with 5 children and the woman who has stayed. He has described his working philosophy in terms that resist the usual softening. "People call me a perfectionist, but I'm not," he said. "I'm a rightist. I do something until it's right, and then I move on to the next thing." He said, "The film industry is about saying no to people, and inherently, you cannot take no for an answer." He said, "Curiosity is the most powerful thing you own." He said, "Imagination is a force that can actually manifest a reality. Don't put limitations on yourself. Others will do that for you." The record he has built does not resemble any other record in the history of the medium. 3 of the 4 highest-grossing films in cinema history came from the same person: Titanic, Avatar, Avatar: The Way of Water. All 3 crossed $2 billion worldwide. No other director has made even one film at that threshold. He has made 3 from 3 different stories, each one built on technology that did not exist when he first conceived it. Each one described during production as a likely catastrophe. He is a billionaire. He became a citizen of a country at the bottom of the world. He descended alone to the deepest point of the ocean in a machine he helped build. But the record tells you the shape of the thing without telling you its content. It does not show the hotel stationery in Rome, the sketch made in a fever, with no money, with the knowledge that the first film had already been taken from him and nothing to do but start the next one. It does not show the 12-minute short film assembled by a man who dismantled a camera to understand it, with dentist money, because the formal education had already ended and the only school left was the work itself. It does not show the boy in Chippewa who organized his friends into elaborate adventures in the landscape near Niagara, who stood close enough to the falls to feel the mist and understood that what was visible from where he was standing was only a fraction of what was actually there. He said, "If you set your goals ridiculously high and it's a failure, you will fail above everyone else's success." A chrome skeleton on hotel stationery, a submersible descending into the Mariana Trench alone, a ship sinking in a Mexican water tank while Hollywood waited for it to take the career of the man who built it down with it. A moon called Pandora, imagined in 1994 and brought into existence 15 years later, still the highest-grossing film human beings have ever paid to see. He did not run out of road. He built it in front of himself, at whatever difficulty was required, until the road reached places no one had been before. That is what the work was. That is what it cost, and that is what it made. If the films of James Cameron were part of how you understood what cinema could actually do, the scale, the technology, the worlds built precisely at the edge of what was possible, leave your thoughts below. Not for the box office records, for the man who decided that the distance between what exists and what he could imagine was simply the next problem to solve. Honor that with a like and subscribe for more stories of figures whose ambition changed the dimensions of what the world believed could be built.